Hello students, welcome to the lecture on barriers in international marketing management. And after this lecture, we will be able to learn the following objectives. Understand the barriers in international marketing management, concept of tariff, define tariff, understand the effects of barriers in international marketing management, and review related studies. Let us start with what international services are. International services are defined in several ways. However, in brief, they are marked by cross-border movement of service-related people, service-related information, service-related physical objects, and/or services-related financial assets. According to the GATT's General Agreement on Trade and Services, 4 modes characterize international services, namely cross-border supply, consumption abroad, commercial presence, and presence of natural persons.
And the barriers to international trade really consist of things that prevent a business, obstacles, if you will, that prevent a business from really operating to its full extent, to its fullest potential. And they can be a number of different things, and I want to review some of the different categories of barriers to international trade, because businesses need to spend a decent amount of time at least assessing what's happening in these areas in order for them to properly position their companies so that they can maybe prevent these from being obstacles to begin with, or if they are, maybe lessen the extent to which they negatively impact the business. And so a few categories of barriers to international trade. The first are what we refer to as sociocultural barriers. And this is very similar to the social environment of business, right? Things that we consider external, of course, to the company, but things that certainly impact us. And so with sociocultural barriers specifically, what we're looking at are how the kind of societal makeup has an effect on our particular business and how we need to alter the business to take into consideration the changes in society. And so some things that we would probably look at as far as changes, right? Obviously, there are changes in society in terms of language. And so that's a very basic consideration, something that we would look at. Differences in language and have to adapt, obviously, and change not only how we offer certain things, and so from menus to the print media that we use, to the people that staff our particular locations, to the way that we market, obviously, those types of things would change. We also have to consider changes in preferences. Although we live in a global economy, there are still some differences with regards to preference in different areas of the world. So, for example, there are some dietary considerations that need to be addressed. And so certain areas of the world don't eat certain types of food as a part of their culture. And so McDonald's, for example, doesn't offer pork products in certain areas because of those differences. And I'm not saying that a business needs to change everything that it's doing, but a business certainly needs to tailor what it's offering to the specific constituents that it's trying to attract almost. And that's a very, very important thing as well. You also have changes, or differences, I should say, in terms of lifestyles. So here in the U.S., we're very what we call individualistic. We like to highlight our own accomplishments. We like to be praised and singled out individually, whereas in certain areas of the world, like Japan, for example, they're very collectivist, meaning that they like to be praised in groups, and they don't necessarily like to be singled out. And so those things have to be considered as well, because that can affect ultimately how successful your business is. Now, in addition to sociocultural differences, you also have to consider some changes in economics. Economic barriers are a very, very important thing. Obviously, with economics, we're referring to typically with the choices that people make, but specifically, some economic indicators can give us some help in this category. And so, first thing, we're going to look at things like population. Population is very, very important. In turn, population usually is a very attractive piece for many businesses. So, for example, India has over 1 billion people. And so that is a significant attraction mechanism because that's a very, very large group of people to have access to that could potentially purchase your product. Now, with India, the big issue there with that population is not only serving that population, but the infrastructure that goes along with that. Infrastructure meaning roads, different ways of getting products from point A to point B. And the infrastructure in India, for those that know, is very, very bad. It's very, very difficult to get supplies. Walmart, for example, is running into a lot of issues, obviously expanding into India because it's simply, its supply chain is dependent upon being able to get products to its stores in large quantity. But based upon the infrastructure and the way that the road system is, you have trucks that, semi-trucks can't drive there. It has to be smaller pickup trucks, and they can't go over 20, 30 miles an hour just because of the quality of the actual roads. And that, prevents them getting products to locations on time, it causes spoilage, so products tend to go bad, especially if they obviously are, types of food. And so that creates a host of issues that could be a potential problem there that needs to be considered. Another one is per capita income, or the amount of money essentially made on a per person basis. In countries that have a very, very low per capita income, right, that equates to a lack of spending power. And so a particular business trying to expand has to consider, well, do these people even have the ability to purchase my product, right? You wouldn't have a product maker like Coach, for example, expanding to a particular market where the per capita income is like $300 per person. It doesn't make any sense. That's their whole basically year's salary for the most part. And so that has to be considered as well, because you not only have to make sure that there's a great number of people, that's awesome, but at the same point in time, do they have the financial means necessary to purchase my product? That can certainly be a barrier if it isn't addressed. All right, in addition to economic barriers, we also have what we call political and legal barriers. And the important thing here is that a country will, or a country's government, I should say, will set the conditions for which a business can operate. And so businesses have to operate within those set of conditions. And this can either be good or bad. It can be extremely freeing because there's very limited regulation, or it can be very difficult to operate in. So, for example, Google has been attempting to get access into China for some time. And from what you probably know about the Chinese government is they are, somewhat controlling. They've lessened over the years. But they still are fairly involved in, business matters and what's done. And so one of the things that China has is state-run media. And so they like to be able to, kind of regulate what is said about the government and those different types of things. And so that kind of runs contrary to what Google's mission is, right? If you look at their mission statement, it's to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. Well, if they're being asked to censor search results so that you only find things that the government wants you to find, does that run contrary to Google's mission? And the answer is yes. And so at one point, I think it was in 2010, Google completely removed itself from China. They said, you know what, the regulations here, we can't provide the service the way we want to provide it and the way that we envisioned it, without kind of running contrary to what our moral beliefs are based upon what you want from us. And so at one point, they completely removed themselves from China altogether, just stating that it was just too much hassle and they couldn't accomplish what their mission was. Now, since then, they've kind of come back and have kind of resumed talks with regards to, okay, China, there's over 1 billion people, so a huge population. This is a great market opportunity, especially when you talk about advertising dollars. So, really, we probably should still have access to China. And how do we do that, though? And so they've resumed talks on how to overcome these barriers and still offer the service in a way that is, the way that is fitting and the way that fits with ultimately their vision. But at the same point in time, the Chinese government represents a significant political and legal barrier to entry because they can significantly impact how the business actually operates. And that's a very, very key consideration there. You also have some issues where some countries can confiscate property, right? So they essentially nationalize all of your property and now they own it. And that can be a very, very big issue there. And we had in large part, that was a big issue we had with Cuba that led to our embargo with them, is that they nationalized a lot of the properties of U.S. citizens. And that wasn't obviously a very good thing. You can't just take what's not yours. And so that caused, obviously, a deterioration in the relationship. Other things to consider besides, simply the government itself are things like quotas. A quota is a restriction on the number of products that can enter a particular country. And this can be used to protect your industries. For example, in the 1980s, the Japanese automobile manufacturers were producing, vehicles and selling them for less than the U.S. automobile manufacturers could actually make them for. There's no way we can compete. And so to protect the U.S. auto industry from, basically kind of going bankrupt and going out of business and losing all those jobs, what the U.S. government did is they implemented quotas. And so they only allowed a certain number of certain types of vehicles into the U.S. in any given year. And so that reduced the supply of those particular products. That way we didn't flood the entire market here with these inexpensive Japanese-made automobiles. And so that's one way, that's one type of kind of barrier, of course, and that's one way a government can try and protect its own industries. And we've seen that happen, over the course of history. Another thing that can be used besides quotas are what we call tariffs. Tariff is essentially a tax on products that enter a country. And so how this works is, let's say there's a 10% tariff on Japanese-made automobiles. And so once those automobiles are shipped in the U.S., then there's a 10% tariff. And what that does is that causes those companies to increase their prices. And so what we're doing is by causing them to increase their prices, we're making it so that the price that they charge is somewhat more competitive to the price that maybe a U.S. automobile manufacturer can assemble them and sell them for, right? And that was a very big thing that happened during the 80s, and to an extent we still have quotas and tariffs to this day, but a lot of companies can bypass those by shifting operations into the U.S., and if things are manufactured here, obviously there's not a tax to bring it in here since it's already created here. And likewise, if it's created here, you can't restrict the number necessarily because you're not shipping it in, it's already created here. Another thing government can do are what we call subsidies. And subsidies are commonly referred to as a reverse tax. It's basically a payment made by government to help certain domestic businesses compete with foreign firms, and so this certainly happened during the 80s. Government has subsidized, a lot of industries. It's subsidized the solar industry for a long period of time, and so it's essentially government's way of trying to level the playing field, assisting its own domestic industries so that they can essentially compete internationally. Now, the most extreme form of any type of, trade barrier, if you will, is an embargo. And I mentioned this before with regards to Cuba. An embargo essentially prevents goods of any kind from coming in from a country. And this is also to and from. And so typically we don't have many embargoes going on. I think at this point in time, the only embargo we do have is with Cuba, and that's for reasons that, they nationalize a lot of property and different things. And obviously we don't necessarily agree with the way that their government kind of controls things as well. So in this particular case, we prevent any goods from going to them or any goods coming from them. And so it's almost like an economic stranglehold, if you will. We're kind of, crush them economically by not allowing their businesses access to our markets, but also not allowing their citizens access to our goods. And so that's a significant way to put kind of strain on a government, is you limit them economically, so their people become so frustrated that at some point they, kind of vote in a new government or overthrow their particular government. So all of these three items represent some key barriers to international trade, and they have to be considered, obviously, to be operating successfully. You have to consider the way the government kind of structures things. If you're going to operate within those kind of confines, if you will, you have to understand the economics of the country you're going into so you can position your product in a way that is going to sell. And you have to certainly be able to tailor your product to the differences in the culture of that particular constituency as well. And so rarely will a business just look at one or two of these. Usually we're looking at each and every one of these elements in order to assess adequately, what the level of competitiveness is in a particular market.
These modes are defined on the basis of the origin of the service supplier and consumer and the degree and type of territorial presence which they have at the moment the service is delivered. Drawing on this definition, international services can be categorized into contact-based services, vehicle-based services, asset-based services, and object-based services. International contact-based services are acts, deeds, or performances by service producers or consumers who cross national boundaries to conduct transactions in direct contact with counterpart service actors. International vehicle-based services are acts, deeds, or performances with location joining properties, thus allowing service producers to create the effects of their presence without being present, transacted across national boundaries via an instrumental framework. International asset-based services are acts, deeds, or performances transacted across national boundaries in the context of physical assets substantially owned or controlled from the home country, critically reflective of home country commercial service ideas. International object-based services are contact-based services fixed or embedded in physical objects which cross national boundaries. People processing services involve each customer directly in delivery of services targeted at the customer's physical person. Tariffs are the most common kind of barrier to trade. Indeed, one of the purposes of the WTO is to enable member countries to negotiate mutual tariff reductions. Before we consider the legal framework that provides the discipline regarding tariffs, we must understand the definition of tariffs, their functions, and their component elements, rates, classifications, and valuations. A tariff is a tax imposed on the import or export of goods. In general parlance, however, a tariff refers to import duties charged at the time goods are imported.
Tariffs, also known as duties, are taxes that are placed on imports and exports out of a country. Unlike a sales tax, tariff rates are often different for every good. Some goods face high tariffs, while others face low tariffs. Tariffs, along with other applicable fees, are collected during customs clearance and serve several different functions. They are used to generate income for the federal government, protect domestic businesses, protect domestic technology, and also protect growing industries. By levying tariffs, it raises the prices of foreign goods and makes it harder for foreign companies to penetrate the domestic market. This also can come with a disadvantage and hurt the consumer. For example, Let's say that a US-made audio speaker is $200 and Australian-made speakers are $180. A 20% tariff of $36 is added to the imported Australian speakers, so they end up costing $216 in the US. This protects the US speaker producers, but may not be as appealing for a consumer that may prefer the Australian brand. Tariffs are sometimes detrimental to the global economy because it inhibits free trade and may decrease innovation if an industry is overprotected. But if employed correctly, they can help protect a nation and its economy.
Tariffs have three primary functions: to serve as a source of revenue, to protect domestic industries, and to remedy trade distortions. The revenue function comes from the fact that the income from tariffs provides governments with a source of funding. In the past, the revenue function was indeed one of the major reasons for applying tariffs, but economic development and the creation of systematic domestic tax codes have reduced its importance in the developed countries. Obviously, one of the most important components in tariff measures is the rate at which the tariff is imposed. As noted in the discussion of the three functions of tariffs, any imposition of a tariff has the potential to reduce the welfare of the world economy as a whole. Since 1947, the GATT has been the standard bearer in an ongoing process of reducing tariff levels. During tariff negotiations, known as rounds, the most recent of which was the Eurogate round, countries set ceilings on their tariff rates. This is known as the bound rate and refers to the highest allowable rate in contrast to the rate that is actually applied, which is referred to as the effective rate. The GATT has been successful in encouraging mutual reduction of these rates. Since the conclusion of the Eurogate round, there have been further efforts to reduce tariffs in specific sectors. Like tariff rates, tariff classifications represent one of the basic components of the tariff system. National tariffs are organized in the form of tables that consist of tariff classification numbers assigned to goods and a corresponding tariff rate. The way in which an item is classified for tariff purposes will have an important and palpable effect on the duties charged. When classifications are applied in an arbitrary fashion, they can in effect nullify rate reductions. The final component in tariffs is the valuation of goods for tariff purposes. When countries assign arbitrary values for tariff purposes, they render tariff rates meaningless. GATT Article 7 and the Agreement on Implementation of Article 7, Customs Valuation Agreement, define international rules for valuation. For under Article 20 of the Custom Valuation Agreement and so on, developing country members may delay application of this agreement for the particular period if other members approved. As of January 2000, some 40 members have delayed implementation. The WTO bans in principle all quantitative restrictions but allows for the imposition of tariffs. It then attempts to reduce the barrier posed by tariffs in tariff negotiations among member countries, whereby they agree to bind themselves to maximum rates, bound rates, for individual items, in principle following the tariff classification nomenclature, and negotiate for their progressive reduction. GATT Article 2 obligates member countries to apply tariff rates that are no higher than their bound rates. GATT Article 28 specifies that when members wish to raise their bound rates or withdraw tariff concessions, they must negotiate and reach agreements with other members with whom they had initially negotiated and entered into consultations with major supplying countries that have a substantial interest in any change in the bound rate. It should be obvious from the discussion so far that there are no problems in terms of WTO rules in setting high bound rates or in not agreeing to be bound at all. The WTO rules therefore allow countries to raise effective tariff rates within the scope of their bound rates and to raise tariff rates at will for non-bound items, regardless of whether it is permitted by the rules. However, a sudden hike in tariff rates will obviously have a detrimental impact on trade. This section analyzes some of the basic economic issues associated with tariffs, specifically why they are preferable to quantitative restrictions and why it is desirable that they be reduced. This section then considers the importance of international tariff reduction negotiations at the WTO. The most basic effect that an import tariff has is to raise domestic prices in the country imposing the tariff. In small countries, defined for our purposes as countries that do not have an influence on international prices, the rise in domestic price is equivalent to the amount of the tariff. In large countries, those that have an impact on international prices, the price rises somewhat less than the amount of the tariff because part of the tariff is reflected in a reduction in international prices. A tariff-induced price rise creates a gap between prices in the importing and exporting countries. This in turn causes supplies, production to rise in the importing country, while demand, consumption falls, which are the essence of the industrial protection function of tariffs. Obviously, a tariff also generates revenues for the government of the importing country, revenue function. Tariffs therefore benefit the government and producers of the importing country in the form of tax revenues at the expense of its consumers in the form of higher prices. Because tariffs bring different benefits and costs to different groups, the net cost to the importing country is the cost to consumers minus profits to producers minus government revenues. This is equal to the sum of the efficiency loss caused by distortions to the pricing system and the profits from improved terms of trade brought by a reduction in international prices. Quantitative restrictions take many forms, the most common of which is import quotas. The effect of quotas is the same as that of import tariffs, reduction of amount of imported goods and higher domestic prices for those goods. Quotas differ from tariffs because the importing country's government gains no revenue from quotas, while importers to whom the quotas are allocated obtain excessive profits, rents from them. The cost of quotas to importing country governments is therefore higher than the cost of tariffs. As we have noted, the WTO agreement bans in principle all quantitative restrictions while permitting tariffs to be used to protect domestic industries. One of the reasons for this is because it is easier to negotiate tariffs down than it is to negotiate a reduction in quantitative restrictions in all their many forms. Tariffs are also preferable from an economic standpoint because unlike quantitative restrictions, tariffs have revenue generating function and less of a distorting effect on markets where monopolies exist. In addition, import quotas may not always be administered fairly. While the WTO agreement permits tariffs as a means of industrial protection, unlike quantitative restrictions, which it bans outright, it also seeks to gradually reduce those tariffs through negotiations among member countries. Below is a summary of the economic rationale for tariff reductions. Reducing tariffs mitigates the loss of efficiency costs generated by the distortions to the price system that the tariff causes. Reducing the degree of market protection also expands the market, allowing producers in exporting countries to enjoy economies of scale and bringing benefits to the economy as a whole. There are also arguments against reducing tariffs. Large countries might argue that tariffs have certain benefits because they improve the terms of trade. From an economic standpoint, it would seem reasonable to conclude that tariff reductions are basically beneficial in that they increase economic efficiency, and therefore tariff reductions are indisputably desirable for all countries other than large countries, in practical terms the vast majority of countries, and for the world economy as a whole. It is rare, however, for countries to completely eliminate their tariffs. In point of practice, countries often impose tariffs not for the purpose of increasing overall welfare from a purely economic standpoint, but for the purpose of redistributing income. As a result of lobbying by various interest groups, policy makers assess marginal benefits differently depending on which group is benefiting. When tariffs are imposed for such domestic reasons, domestic political interests often will outweigh greater economic welfare in the view of the government, making it more difficult to reduce tariffs. This domestic political reality is what makes international negotiations to reduce tariffs, the basic strategy of the WTO, so important. When international negotiations are conditional upon mutual benefits, governments are more likely to forego the marginal benefits that positively affect one sector to obtain the broader general welfare benefits that affect a group of sectors. In this section, we consider problems in the trade policies and measures of individual countries. We look both at measures that clearly violate the WTO and at measures that are within the scope of WTO rules but nonetheless have a detrimental impact on trade. Chief among the measures considered are high tariff rates and low bound rates. We also touch upon examples of voluntary reductions in effective tariff rates by individual countries when the evidence is clear and discussion is warranted. We have already noted that countries must go through the procedures outlined in GATT Article 28 and obtain approval for a hike in their bound rates before they are able to raise their tariffs to levels in excess of the current bound rate. Raising tariffs beyond the bound rate without going through these procedures constitutes a clear violation of GATT Article 2. The WTO Councils and Dispute Settlement Mechanism address such violations. When changes in tariff classification result in what for all purposes is a tariff hike, the case must be referred to the Customs Cooperation Council (CCC), also known as the World Customs Organization or WCO, for a judgment on the reclassification. High tariffs, low percentage of bound items, and tariff hikes within bound rates are not, strictly speaking, unfair trade policies and measures in violation of WTO rules, but they nevertheless have a detrimental impact on trade when they are used too easily or too often. Instead of taking the cut that would otherwise apply to final bound tariffs in the band to which the processed product belongs, with the exception of the top band, the processed product shall take the cut applicable to the tariffs that fall in the highest band. These supplementary cuts shall be moderated for the products concerned in two circumstances. First, where the absolute difference between the processed and primary product tariffs after application of the normal tariff formula would be 5% ad valorem or less in any given tire, except in the case of the bottom tire. No additional tariff escalation adjustment shall be required. Second, the tariff escalation adjustment formula cannot be applied in full, where doing so would reduce the tariff for the processed product below that applicable to the primary product. In this situation, the rate of reduction for the processed product shall be moderated to ensure that it goes no further than equating to the actual rate for the primary product. Tariff escalation treatment shall not apply to any product that is declared as sensitive. Where the reduction for a tropical product would result in a reduction that is greater than under the tariff escalation formula, the tropical product reduction shall apply. In this section is the evolving approach to NTMs taken first by GATT and then by the WTO. It also describes briefly the approaches to NTMs taken increasingly by countries when they create preferential trade agreements. In each case, we first consider border, import and export NTMs and then turn to behind the border NTMs. The GATT approach to border NTMs differs on the import side and the export side. The approach can be loosely characterized as follows. First, on the import side, GATT was designed to serve as a negotiating forum in which reciprocal, voluntary and non-discriminatory MFN tariff bargaining among member governments would lead to tariff bindings. Of course, tariff bindings in themselves are not likely to be valued by governments, but it was anticipated that these bindings would imply meaningful increases in market access for foreign exporters and for this reason would be valued by the participating governments. The GATT approach to dealing with behind the border NTMs can also be described as a minimalist or shallow integration approach. The essence of this approach follows the logic described above for GATT's approach to border NTMs on the import side, though the tactics differ. In particular, as observed above, the drafters of GATT were well aware that policies other than tariffs could easily substitute for tariffs and might become attractive if a country constrained bound its tariff as a result of a negotiation. But in the case of behind the border NTMs, issues of national sovereignty precluded the kind of approach to this issue that was taken with regard to border NTMs, example, the prohibition on quantitative restrictions. The approach to NTMs has evolved from the GATT to the WTO. As described above, GATT's approach to NTMs was minimalist, although as mentioned in the later GATT years, some of the obligations regarding NTMs, example, export subsidies, became more stringent. With the creation of the WTO, this trend was continued and extended in a number of important ways. The WTO approach to border NTMs represents a significant tightening of obligations relative to GATT along a number of dimensions. For example, the WTO Safeguard Agreement prohibits the use of various forms of border NTMs, example, OMAs and VERs that were considered grey area measures under GATT and had become popular in the last decade of GATT before the creation of the WTO. And the WTO Subsidies and Countervailing Measures SCM agreement strengthens significantly the prohibition against export subsidies. The WTO approach to behind the border NTMs also represents a significant tightening of obligations relative to GATT along a number of dimensions. For example, the WTO Technical Barriers to Trade (TBT) and Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures SPS agreement represent a significant strengthening of the non-discrimination national treatment obligations regarding certain kinds of domestic regulations. In addition, the WTO SCM agreement contains substantial commitments regarding domestic subsidies that were not included in GATT. In a sense, while the overall approach of the WTO with respect to behind the border NTMs can still be characterized as one of shallow integration, there has been some evolution over the history of the GATT WTO in the direction of deep integration. Now in the end, let us summarize what we have learnt in this lecture. Legal framework in international marketing is affected by the WTO regulations. It bans in principle all quantitative restrictions but allows for the imposition of tariffs. It then attempts to reduce the barrier posed by tariffs in tariff negotiations among member countries. A tariff is a tax placed on imported goods. Each country has separate regulations, but there are 5 main types of tariffs: revenue, ad valorem, specific, prohibitive, and protective. A revenue tariff increases government funds. An ad valorem tariff means that the tax applies to a percentage of the import's value, such as a set number of cents on every dollar of value. A specific tariff, on the other hand, means that the tax is not concerned with the estimated value of the imported goods, but rather is based on specific amount of the goods. A prohibitive tariff is one that is such as high cost that it keeps the item from being imported. A protective tariff is used to raise the price of imported goods as a protective measure against the competition from foreign markets. WTO rules have a detrimental impact on trade. Chief among the measures considered are high tariff rates and low bound rates.